The winter of 1942 fell over Detroit like a gray shroud, bringing with it winds that cut through the worn wool coats of factory workers and housewives alike. The city had transformed itself almost overnight. Its assembly lines that once produced Fords and Chryslers now churning out tanks, aircraft parts, and ammunition. The streets smelled of motor oil and determination, a peculiar blend that seemed to seep into brick facades of the tenement buildings and linger in the cold air long after the factory whistles had blown. In one of these cramped apartments on the east side, where the wallpaper peeled in the corners and the radiator clanked through the night, lived a woman whose hands would alter the course of battles she would never see. Her name was Dorothy Keene, and at 27 years old, she possessed a skill that seemed quaint in the age of mechanized warfare. She could sew anything. Dorothy had learned to thread a needle before she could write her name. Sitting beside her grandmother in a tenement much like this one, watching wrinkled fingers guide fabric beneath the presser foot of an ancient Singer sewing machine. That machine, black and gold and heavy as sin, now sat in Dorothy's own apartment, positioned near the window, where the light was best during the precious daylight hours. She had no way of knowing, as she bent over that machine in the early days of America's entry into war, that her stitches would become weapons, that her careful seams would hold explosives that would tear through German panzer divisions in the frozen fields of Europe. The story of how a seamstress from Detroit became an unlikely warrior begins not with grand gestures or patriotic speeches, but with a notice tacked to the bulletin board at the local employment office. Dorothy had gone there on a Tuesday morning, her last paycheck from the dress factory folded in her purse. The factory had closed 3 weeks earlier, another casualty of wartime conversion, and she had been stretching that final payment across rent, food, and the heating bill with the careful mathematics of the poor. The notice was typed on official letterhead, the kind that made everything seem both important and vaguely threatening. Seamstresses needed for defense work. Specialized skills required. Discretion mandatory. Apply in person. The address listed was a warehouse on the industrial edge of the city, near the river where the smokestacks of the steel mills painted the sky in shades of orange and black. Dorothy copied the address onto the back of her grocery list and took 2 buses to get there, arriving with cold reddened cheeks and hope flickering in her chest like a candle in a draft. The warehouse looked abandoned from the outside, its windows painted over with thick black paint, its loading dock empty except for a single military truck with government plates. A man in civilian clothes, but with the bearing of a soldier, checked her name against a list and escorted her inside. What Dorothy found defied every expectation she had carried with her on those 2 bus rides. The warehouse floor had been converted into something between a factory and a military installation. Rows upon rows of industrial sewing machines stood like soldiers at attention, but these were no ordinary machines. They were reinforced heavy-duty models, and the women operating them worked with materials Dorothy had never seen in any dress shop or curtain manufacturer. Heavy canvas, rubberized fabrics, leather straps, metal grommets the size of quarters. The air smelled of machine oil, rubber cement, and something else she couldn't quite identify, something sharp and chemical that made her eyes water slightly. A woman in a crisp military uniform, her hair pinned back in a severe bun, approached Dorothy with a clipboard and a measuring gaze that seemed to take in everything from the calluses on her fingers to the quality of her shoes. "Can you sew a straight seam under pressure?" the woman asked without preamble. Dorothy nodded. "Can you follow complex patterns without error?" Another nod. "Can you keep your mouth shut about everything you see and do here?" This time Dorothy found her voice. "Yes, ma'am." The woman made a note on her clipboard. "Good. You start tomorrow. 7 a.m. sharp. You'll be sewing bomb pouches." If you've ever wondered how ordinary people become part of extraordinary moments in history, if you've ever felt that pull toward stories that remind us of the strength hidden in simple hands and quiet determination, then you're in the right place. Touch that subscribe button, because the story of Dorothy Keene is one that deserves to be remembered, and there are so many more stories like hers waiting to be told. The training period lasted exactly 1 week. 7 days in which Dorothy learned to handle materials that could kill her if she made a single careless mistake. The bomb pouches, she discovered, were specialized carrying cases designed to be strapped to the bodies of resistance fighters in occupied Europe. Each pouch was precisely engineered to hold a shaped charge, a compact explosive device that could penetrate tank armor when placed correctly. The sewing tolerances were measured in millimeters. Too loose, and the charge might shift during transport, potentially detonating prematurely. Too tight, and the fighter wouldn't be able to extract the explosive quickly enough when opportunity presented itself. Every seam had to be perfect, every stitch uniform. The thread they used was a special military grade, treated with chemicals to resist moisture, heat, and friction. The needles were German-made, ironically enough, purchased before the war and hoarded now like gold. If a needle broke during production, work stopped until a supervisor could account for every piece, ensuring no metal fragment remained in the pouch that might interfere with the explosive mechanism. Dorothy learned to sew wearing thick gloves to protect her hands from the industrial-strength adhesives that bonded the layers of the pouches together. She learned to work with templates that were color-coded for different types of explosives. She learned to sign her work with small numbered tags sewn into an interior seam, so that if a pouch failed in the field, the fault could be traced back to its maker. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like snow accumulating on a roof, heavy and cold and impossible to shake off. By the end of that first week, Dorothy's fingers ached with a deep, bone-level pain that no amount of hot water soaking could ease. She would return to her apartment after the 10-hour shifts and find herself too exhausted to eat, collapsing instead onto her narrow bed and falling immediately into a dreamless sleep. But she also felt something else, something she hadn't experienced in the long, gray years of the Depression and the early war months. She felt useful. She felt like she mattered. Every pouch that passed inspection and moved down the line toward shipping was a small victory, a tiny act of defiance against the forces that had plunged the world into darkness. The other women in the warehouse became her companions in this strange, secret work. There was Helen, a grandmother of 52 who had worked in upholstery for 30 years and could sew leather as easily as cotton. There was Margaret, barely 20, whose husband was somewhere in the Pacific, and who sewed with tears streaming silently down her face most days. There was Ruth, who had escaped from Germany in 1938 and who understood, in a way the American-born women couldn't quite grasp, exactly what their work meant for the people who would use these pouches. They didn't talk much during work hours. The noise of the machines and the concentration required making conversation difficult. But during lunch breaks, they shared sandwiches and cigarettes and small pieces of their lives, building the kind of bonds that form between people doing difficult things together. The apartment Dorothy returned to each night was a far cry from a home she had imagined for herself when she was younger. She had grown up during the Depression, watching her own mother take in washing, and sewing to keep food on the table after Dorothy's father had died in a factory accident. Dorothy had promised herself that she would do better, that she would marry well and have a house with a real dining room and curtains that matched. But the Depression had stretched on, and the young men she might have married had either left Detroit looking for work or had given up on the idea of supporting a family. By the time the war started, Dorothy had resigned herself to spinsterhood, to a life measured out in rent payments and small economies. The apartment reflected this resignation. It consisted of 3 rooms, a main room that served as both living room and bedroom, a narrow kitchen barely large enough to turn around in, and a bathroom with plumbing that groaned and shuddered whenever she turned on the taps. The furniture was a collection of cast-offs and thrift store finds. The only beautiful thing in the entire space was that Singer's sewing machine, which Dorothy kept polished and oiled, its black enamel gleaming even in the dim light from the single overhead bulb. At night, when she couldn't sleep, Dorothy would sometimes sit at that machine and sew scraps of fabric into quilt squares, letting the familiar motion of the work calm her racing mind. But increasingly, she found herself thinking about the pouches, about the people who would carry them, about the tanks they were meant to destroy. The winter deepened, and with it came news from the fronts that made the work feel even more urgent. The Germans were pushing east into Russia, their panzer divisions rolling across the frozen steppes like mechanical locusts. In North Africa, Rommel's tanks dominated the desert, their superior armor and firepower overwhelming Allied positions. At the warehouse, production quotas increased. The women were asked to work 12-hour shifts, then 14. Dorothy would arrive in the pre-dawn darkness and leave long after sunset, seeing daylight only through the blacked-out windows of the warehouse. Her hands became so accustomed to the work that she could almost sew in her sleep, her fingers finding the right tension, the right spacing, without conscious thought. The supervisors began to notice her work. While other seamstresses might complete 15 pouches in a shift, Dorothy consistently produced 20 or more, all of them passing inspection on the first try. Her seams were straight as ruler lines, her stitching so uniform it looked machine perfect. In March of 1943, she was called into the office of the warehouse director, a severe-looking colonel named Morrison who had a wall full of commendations and a face that suggested he had seen too much of war's ugliness to ever smile again. Colonel Morrison sat behind a desk pile with folders and production reports, and he studied Dorothy for a long moment before speaking. "Miss Keene," he said finally, his voice carrying the flat vowels of the Midwest, "your work has been exemplary. The pouches you produce have a failure rate of less than 1%, which is significantly below average." He paused, and Dorothy felt her heart hammering, uncertain whether this was praise or the prelude to some new burden. "We're starting a new program," Morrison continued, "and we need our best people for it. The pouches you've been making go to resistance fighters in Europe. They use them for sabotage operations, hit and run attacks. But we're developing something new. Larger charges, more sophisticated delivery systems, designed specifically for use by trained partisans working in coordinated cells behind enemy lines. The pouches for these charges are more complex. They require precision work, and they'll be going to operations that have been planned at the highest levels of military intelligence." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "I'm asking you to join this program. The pay is better, but the hours are longer, and the work is more demanding. You'll be handling materials that are more dangerous, and the secrecy requirements are absolute. You won't be able to tell anyone what you're doing, not your family, not your friends, no one. Can you do this?" Dorothy thought about her empty apartment, about the absence of family or friends who would notice if she disappeared into even deeper secrecy. She thought about the women at the warehouse, about Ruth's quiet grief for the homeland she had fled, about Margaret's husband fighting somewhere in the jungles of the Pacific. She thought about the newsreels she had seen at the movie theater, about the devastation in Europe's cities, about the faces of refugees streaming along muddy roads. "Yes, sir," she said, "I can do this." Morrison nodded, as if he had expected nothing else. "Good. Report to Base 7 tomorrow. You'll be working on the Special Projects line. Your supervisor will be Lieutenant Carmichael. She'll brief you on the specifications." He dismissed her with a gesture, already turning his attention back to the papers on his desk, and Dorothy walked out of the office feeling as if she had just enlisted in a war she couldn't see but could only fight with needle and thread. Base 7 was separated from the main warehouse floor by heavy canvas curtains that blocked both sight and sound. Inside, Dorothy found a smaller operation, only 15 sewing stations instead of the hundreds in the main floor. The women here worked with an intensity that bordered on religious fervor, bent over their machines with expressions of fierce concentration. Lieutenant Carmichael was a young woman, probably no older than Dorothy herself, with red hair tucked under her service cap and hands that bore the telltale calluses of someone who had done this work before supervising it. She led Dorothy to a station where samples of the new pouches were laid out like specimens in a museum. These were different from anything Dorothy had sewn before. They were larger, with multiple compartments and a complex system of straps and buckles. The materials included not just canvas and leather, but metal components that had to be sewn into reinforced pockets with absolute precision. "These pouches," Lieutenant Carmichael explained, "are designed to carry shaped charges that weigh up to 15 pounds. They need to distribute that weight evenly across the body, allow for quick access, and protect the explosive from impact and moisture. Every pouch you make will be paired with a specific charge, tested, and then shipped as a unit. The partisan who receives it will have trained on identical equipment, so it needs to be perfect. No variations, no improvisation, just exact replication of the specifications." She handed Dorothy a pattern that was easily 3 times as complex as anything she had worked with before, with measurements marked in fractions of inches and notes about stress points and load-bearing seams. "Can you do this?" Carmichael asked, and Dorothy heard an echo of Colonel Morrison's question, heard the weight of expectation and need that lay behind it. She studied the pattern, her trained eye already breaking it down into steps, into sequences of cuts and seams and reinforcements. "Yes," she said. "I can do this." The learning curve was steep and unforgiving. The first pouch Dorothy completed took her an entire shift. 12 hours of painstaking work that left her with a tension headache and fingers that trembled from fatigue. When she submitted it for inspection, it was rejected. The metal grommets weren't aligned properly, creating a stress point that could tear under load. She unpicked the seams, her face burning with humiliation, and started again. The second attempt passed inspection, but barely, with notes about uneven stitching on the interior compartment. The third was better, the fourth better still, and by the end of her first week in Base 7, Dorothy had developed a rhythm, a muscle memory for this new and demanding work. She learned to feel the tension in the fabric, to sense when a seam was pulling too tight or lying too loose. She learned to check and recheck her measurements, to use the calipers and rulers that sat at her station like surgical instruments. Most importantly, she learned to push through the fatigue and the doubt, to trust her hands even when her mind wanted to give up. The other women in Base 7 became a sort of sisterhood, bound together by their shared secret and their shared burden. They celebrated small victories, like when production quotas were met or exceeded, and they supported each other through the inevitable failures and frustrations. And slowly, pouch by pouch, stitch by stitch, Dorothy Keene became one of the best specialized seamstresses in the entire program. By the summer of 1943, Dorothy had settled into a routine that consumed her life completely. She woke at 5 in the morning, dressed in the dark, and walked to the bus stop through streets that were still empty except for other early shift workers and the occasional military patrol. She arrived at the warehouse by 6:30, giving herself time to prepare her station before the 7 o'clock start. She worked through lunch most days, eating a sandwich at her machine while her hands continued their work. She left the warehouse at 8 or 9 at night, took 2 buses home, and fell into bed with barely enough energy to undress. Sundays were her only day off, and she spent them sleeping, doing laundry, and occasionally walking to the library to check out books she was usually too tired to read. It was a narrow life, circumscribed by work and secrecy, but it was also a life with purpose. Every pouch she completed represented a potential victory, a tank destroyed, a convoy disrupted, a small piece of the vast and terrible machinery of war thrown off balance. The warehouse received occasional updates about how the equipment was performing in the field, though these reports were carefully sanitized to remove any identifying details. In August, Lieutenant Carmichael gathered the Bay 7 workers and told them that pouches from the production line had been used in a successful operation in occupied France, resulting in the destruction of a German supply depot. She didn't provide details, but the implication was clear. Their work was making a difference. The women celebrated quietly, with an extra coffee break and a sense of satisfaction that warmed even the cynical old-timers who had seen too many wartime promises turn to dust. It was in September of 1943 that Dorothy first heard about the tank killer teams. Lieutenant Carmichael brought it up during a production meeting. Her voice careful and measured. "We're expanding the program," she said. "The Office of Strategic Services is working with partisan groups in Eastern Europe to form specialized anti-armor units. These teams will operate behind German lines, targeting tank columns and mechanized units. They need equipment that's specifically designed for this mission. Pouches that can carry multiple charges, that can be accessed quickly, that can withstand harsh conditions. We've been selected to produce these pouches." She paused, letting the significance of this sink in. "The OSS has requested our best seamstresses for this project. That means you—" Dorothy felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the warehouse. Targeting tanks meant getting close to them, close enough to place charges on their armor, close enough to be seen and shot. The people who would use these pouches would be undertaking missions that were essentially suicide runs, gambling their lives on speed and surprise, and the hope that a small explosive charge could stop a massive machine. And she would be making the equipment that would allow them to do it. The responsibility felt crushing, like a weight settling on her chest that made it hard to breathe. But she also felt a strange kind of honor, a recognition that she had been chosen for this because her work was good enough, reliable enough, to be trusted with such a critical task. She raised her hand, and when Lieutenant Carmichael called on her, she asked a question that had been burning in her mind. "Will we know if they work?" Will we know if the pouches hold up? Carmichael's expression softened slightly, a crack in her professional demeanor. We'll know, she said quietly. The OSS provides after-action reports when operations are completed successfully. If the equipment fails, we'll know that too. She didn't elaborate on what failure might mean, didn't paint pictures of partisans caught in the open or charges that failed to detonate or pouches that tore at critical moments. She didn't need to. Every woman in Base 7 could imagine it well enough on her own. The new pouches were more complex than anything Dorothy had worked on before. They were designed to be worn like a vest, with multiple pockets positioned for easy access, each one capable of holding a shaped charge. The fabric was a specialized blend that wouldn't tear under stress, but would burn away quickly if exposed to flame, preventing the wearer from being trapped in burning material. The seams had to be reinforced with a new type of thread that was stronger than standard military grade, but also more difficult to work with, prone to tangling and breaking if the tension wasn't perfectly maintained. Dorothy spent hours practicing with sample materials before she was allowed to work on actual production pieces. She broke countless needles, wasted yards of expensive fabric, and went home every night with her hands cramping and her eyes burning from the strain of the close work. But gradually, painfully, she mastered the technique. Her pouches began to pass inspection consistently. Within a month, she was producing 5 completed vest pouches per shift, a number that the supervisors initially considered impossible. The work demanded not just skill but a kind of meditation, a state of focused attention that blocked out everything else. Dorothy found that when she was sewing these pouches, the rest of the world fell away. She didn't think about the cold apartment waiting for her, didn't think about the loneliness that had become her constant companion, didn't think about the war news that grew grimmer with each passing week. She thought only about the work, about the exact placement of each stitch, about the tension in the thread, and the alignment of the reinforcements. In some strange way, this absolute focus became a kind of peace, a refuge from the anxiety and uncertainty that defined wartime existence. The other women in Base 7 noticed a change in her, the way she seemed to disappear into her work, and they began to treat her with a mixture of respect and concern, as if she were somehow both more and less present than the rest of them. Helen, the grandmother who worked the station next to Dorothy's, sometimes brought extra food from home and left it at Dorothy's station during lunch breaks, wordlessly ensuring that she ate something. Margaret, when she caught Dorothy working through breaks, would come and physically turn off her machine, forcing her to rest. And Ruth, who understood better than any of them what it meant to flee from advancing armies and hide from searching patrols, sometimes placed a hand on Dorothy's shoulder at the end of shift and said simply, "Thank you." These small gestures of solidarity became the closest thing Dorothy had to a social life, and she treasured them in a way she couldn't quite articulate. The autumn of 1943 brought the first confirmed reports of the tank killer teams in action. Lieutenant Carmichael posted a notice on the Base 7 bulletin board. Operation successful. Equipment performed as specified. 3 enemy tanks destroyed. Personnel returned safely. The notice was unsigned and undated, offering no details about where or when or who. But it was enough. The women gathered around that bulletin board during their break, reading and rereading those simple sentences as if they were poetry. 3 tanks destroyed. 3 massive machines that had probably killed dozens of Allied soldiers, that had terrorized civilians and rolled through villages, leaving destruction in their wake, stopped by charges carried in pouches made by women in a Detroit warehouse. Dorothy stood at the back of the crowd, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to shed, and felt something shift inside her. The work had always been important, but now it was real in a way it hadn't been before. Now she could picture it. Partisans moving through the darkness, the weight of the pouches familiar against their bodies, approaching a lagered German tank column with hearts pounding and hands steady, reaching into those pouches she had sewn, and pulling out the charges, placing them with care, retreating into the shadows, and then the bloom of fire as the charges detonated, as steel armor buckled and fuel ignited, and the machine that had seemed invincible became nothing but a burning wreck. She had done that, in her way. Her hands had made it possible. The reports continued to arrive through the winter and into 1944, each one a small confirmation of lives saved and battles turned. By March, the bulletin board in Base 7 displayed a running tally. 17 tanks destroyed, 5 armored vehicles disabled, 2 supply depots demolished. The numbers were cold and clinical. But behind each one was a story of courage and risk, of people who had taken equipment made by Dorothy and her colleagues and used it to strike back against an occupying force that had seemed unstoppable. The work intensified as the Allied High Command began planning for the invasion of France. Production quotas doubled, then tripled. The women of Bay 7 began working 16-hour shifts, sleeping on cots in a converted storage room when they were too exhausted to go home. Dorothy lost track of days and weeks, time blurring into an endless succession of pouches and inspections and quotas met or missed. She lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had never been substantial to begin with. Her hands developed a permanent tremor from fatigue and repetitive stress. But she kept working, driven by a compulsion she couldn't name, a need to do everything she possibly could to contribute to the defeat of the forces that had brought so much suffering to the world. The supervisors began to worry about her, about all of them, but the needs of the war were insatiable, and there were never enough hours or hands or materials to meet the demand. It was in May of 1944, just weeks before the D-Day invasion that the world didn't yet know was coming, that Dorothy experienced her own small moment of crisis. She was working on a particularly complex pouch, one designed for a special operation that required additional compartments and reinforcements, when her hands simply stopped working. She was midway through a seam, the needle positioned above the fabric, when her fingers refused to grip the material, refused to guide it under the presser foot. She sat there, frozen, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else, feeling a tide of panic rising in her chest. The machine sat silent, waiting for her to continue, but she couldn't make her body respond. Lieutenant Carmichael noticed after several minutes and came over, her expression concerned. "Dorothy," she said gently, using her first name for perhaps the first time ever. "When did you last take a break?" Dorothy tried to answer, but found she couldn't remember. Days ago? A week? The time had become fluid, unmeasurable. Carmichael made a decision then, one that probably violated regulations, but which she made anyway. She shut down Dorothy's machine, helped her to her feet, and walked her to the small office she used for paperwork. "Sit," she ordered, and Dorothy sat, her legs folding beneath her like a puppet with cut strings. Carmichael poured coffee from a thermos, strong and black, and probably cold, and pushed the cup into Dorothy's hands. "Drink," she said, and Dorothy drank, the bitter liquid cutting to the fog in her mind. They sat in silence for a long time, and gradually Dorothy felt something in her chest loosen, some tight knot tension unwinding just enough to let her breathe properly again. "I can't stop," Dorothy said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I stop, if I rest, then someone dies. Someone who could have lived if I had made one more pouch, sewn one more seam." Carmichael was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Do you know what happens if you burn out?" she asked. "If you push yourself until you break?" Dorothy shook her head. "You make mistakes," Carmichael said bluntly. "Your work gets sloppy, your seams get uneven, and then the pouches fail in the field. And then someone dies anyway. But this time it's because the equipment didn't work, because the seamstress who made it was too exhausted to do the job right." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "You're one of my best workers, Dorothy. Maybe the best I've ever supervised. But you're no good to anyone if you work yourself into the ground. The wars are going to be won or lost because you took a day off." Dorothy wanted to argue, wanted to insist that every moment mattered, but she was too tired to fight. She nodded, defeated, and Carmichael made another decision that was probably against regulations. She sent Dorothy home with orders not to return for 3 days, and she made it clear that if Dorothy showed up before then, she would be barred from the warehouse entirely. Dorothy went home, slept for 18 hours straight, and woke feeling hollow and strange, as if she'd been away on a long journey, and returned to find everything subtly different. The 3 days of forced rest were both a blessing and a torture. Dorothy's body needed the recovery time desperately. She slept, ate properly for the first time in weeks, and slowly felt strength returning to her limbs and clarity to her mind. But the absence of work left a void that she didn't know how to fill. She tried to read, but the books seemed frivolous compared to the weight of what was happening in the world. She tried to walk around the neighborhood, But the sight of gold stars and windows, markers of sons and husbands and brothers who would never come home, filled her with a guilt she couldn't shake. She felt useless, purposeless, and the days crawled by with agonizing slowness. On the morning of the fourth day, she returned to the warehouse with a mixture of relief and trepidation, unsure what she would find. Lieutenant Carmichael greeted her at the entrance to Base 7 with a rare smile. "Welcome back," she said. "We missed you, and we have news." She led Dorothy to the bulletin board, where a new notice had been posted. This one was longer than usual, more detailed. It described an operation in Yugoslavia, where a team of partisans had used equipment from Base 7 to stage an ambush on a German tank column moving through a mountain pass. The operation had been a complete success. 11 tanks destroyed, dozens of German soldiers killed or captured, and the partisan team had escaped with only minor injuries. The notice specifically mentioned the quality of the equipment, noting that despite harsh conditions and heavy use, not a single pouch had failed. At the bottom, someone had written in pen, "The team sends their thanks to the women of Detroit." Dorothy stood in front of that notice for a long time, reading it over and over, and felt something shift inside her. The work wasn't just abstract anymore, wasn't just numbers on a tally sheet or reports sanitized of all identifying details. It was real people in a real place who had survived because the equipment worked, because the seams had held, because a seamstress in Detroit had done her job well. The guilt and exhaustion that had dogged her for months didn't disappear entirely, but they became manageable, transformed from crushing weight into something she could carry. She returned to her station, sat down at her machine, and began to work with a renewed sense of purpose. The months that followed were a blur of production and news from the fronts. The Allied invasion of France succeeded, despite terrible casualties on the beaches of Normandy. The armies began to push east, liberating France and Belgium, and driving toward Germany itself. In the east, Soviet forces rolled westward, crushing German divisions in massive encirclement battles. And everywhere behind the lines and in occupied territories, resistance forces used equipment made in places like Base 7 to strike at the occupiers. The tally on the bulletin board grew: 23 tanks, 31 tanks, 45 tanks. Each number represented a victory, a small piece of the vast mosaic of the war, and each one was made possible in part by the work Dorothy and her colleagues did. It was in February of 1945, with the war in Europe entering its final phase, that Dorothy received a recognition that would define the rest of her life. She was called to Colonel Morrison's office again, and this time she found not just Morrison, but several other officers she didn't recognize, along with Lieutenant Carmichael, who was smiling in a way that made Dorothy nervous. Morrison stood when she entered, which was unusual enough to make her even more anxious. "Miss Keene," he said formally, "I've asked you here today to inform you of something that will remain classified for the duration of the war, but which I believe you have a right to know." He gestured to one of the other officers, who opened a folder and began to read. Based on operational reports from multiple theaters and verified through after-action analysis, equipment produced by Dorothy Keene of Base 7, Detroit War Production Facility, has been used in operations resulting in the destruction of 31 enemy tanks, 14 armored vehicles, and numerous other targets. He looked up from the folder, his expression serious. "Miss Keene, your work has directly contributed to saving an estimated 300 Allied lives, and potentially thousands more indirectly. Your pouches have performed flawlessly in every reported operation. You are being commended for exceptional service to the war effort, and while this commendation cannot be made public at this time, it will be entered into your official record." Dorothy stood there, stunned into silence, trying to process what she had just heard. 31 tanks, 31 massive machines of war, stopped by charges carried in pouches she had sewn. The number seemed impossible, too large to be real. But Morrison was still talking, explaining that her name was being forwarded to the War Department for possible recognition after the war, that her work had set new standards for quality and reliability, that she should be proud of what she had accomplished. Dorothy nodded mechanically, accepting the praise without really hearing it, her mind stuck on that number. 31. She thought about what Lieutenant Carmichael had told her months ago, about how each tank represented dozens of soldiers at risk, about how stopping a tank could change the course of a battle. She thought about the partisans who had carried her pouches into danger, who had trusted their lives to seam she had sewn. She thought about all of it and felt tears streaming down her face before she realized she was crying. Morrison, uncomfortable with emotion, dismissed her quickly, and Carmichael escorted her back to Base 7, where the other women had somehow already heard the news. They applauded as she entered, a soft rain of applause in the cavernous space, and Dorothy felt simultaneously honored and embarrassed, proud and humbled. She returned to her station, sat down at her machine, and went back to work, because that was all she knew how to do, and because there was still a war to win. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. The news reached the warehouse in the middle of a shift, broadcast over the loudspeakers that usually carried only production updates and safety announcements. For a moment, the machines fell silent as the women absorbed the news. Then someone began to cry, and then someone else began to laugh, and then the whole warehouse erupted in a chaos of emotion that the supervisors didn't even try to control. Women hugged each other, strangers and colleagues alike. Some knelt on the floor in prayer. Others just stood motionless, too overwhelmed to react. Dorothy found herself surrounded by the women of Base 7, all of them talking at once, crying and laughing, and trying to process the reality that the war they had fought in their own way was finally over. Lieutenant Carmichael appeared with a bottle of whiskey from somewhere, and they passed it around, taking small sips and toasting victory and peace and survival. The celebration lasted until the end of the shift, when they were finally sent home with instructions not to report the next day, that they would be contacted about the warehouse's future operations. Dorothy walked out into a Detroit evening that seemed brighter than any she could remember, even though the streetlights were still dim for the wartime blackout regulations that hadn't yet been lifted. She took her 2 buses home, and for once she didn't mind the journey, didn't mind the waiting or the crowds. She felt buoyant, lighter than she had in years, as if some great burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The transition from war to peace was harder than Dorothy had expected. The warehouse continued operations for another month, fulfilling existing contracts and wrapping up projects, but the urgency was gone, replaced by an atmosphere of anticlimax and uncertainty. The women of Base 7 began to drift away, returning to previous jobs or starting new ones, getting married, moving away from Detroit to places where opportunities seemed brighter. Helen retired to live with her daughter in Ohio. Margaret was reunited with her husband, who came home from the Pacific with malaria and shrapnel scars, but alive. Ruth received word that some of her family had survived the camps, and she began the long process of trying to bring them to America. Dorothy remained at her station, sewing pouches that no one needed anymore, waiting for instructions that never quite came. In June, Colonel Morrison called her to his office one final time. The warehouse was closing, he told her. The contracts had been fulfilled, the equipment was being mothballed, and the workers were being released. He handed her a final paycheck, a letter of recommendation that praised her skills and dedication in the most glowing terms possible without revealing classified information, and a small envelope that contained her official commendation. Still classified, but hers to keep. "What you did here matters," Morrison said, his voice gruff with an emotion he wouldn't name. "Don't ever forget that. You helped win this war as surely as any soldier on the front lines." Dorothy thanked him, took the papers, and walked out of the warehouse for the last time, past the empty sewing stations and the silent machines, out into a summer afternoon that felt both familiar and strange, as if she were seeing the world with new eyes. The months that followed were difficult in ways Dorothy hadn't anticipated. She found work easily enough, her skills and experience making her valuable to the garment manufacturers that were beginning to ramp up civilian production again. But the work felt hollow, meaningless compared to what she had done during the war. She sewed dresses and curtains and upholstery, and every seam reminded her of the pouches, of the weight and importance of work that mattered. She moved through her days in a kind of fog, going through the motions of normal life while feeling disconnected from it. She tried to reconnect with old friends, but found they had all changed, or perhaps she had changed, and the conversations felt strained and artificial. She went to church occasionally, seeking some kind of comfort or meaning. But the sermons about peace and forgiveness rang hollow to someone who had spent years contributing to the machinery of war. She felt lost, adrift in a world that had moved on while she remained anchored to a past she couldn't discuss and couldn't forget. It was Ruth who finally helped her find a path forward. They had stayed in touch after the warehouse closed, meeting occasionally for coffee and conversation. Ruth had successfully brought 2 of her cousins to America, and she was working with a refugee organization, helping other survivors find housing and jobs and begin the process of rebuilding their lives. One day, she asked Dorothy if she would be willing to teach sewing to some of the refugee women to help them develop skills they could use to support themselves. Dorothy agreed, hesitant at first but willing to try, and found in teaching something of the purpose she had lost. The refugee women she worked with came from all over Europe, each carrying stories of loss and survival that made Dorothy's own struggles seem small in comparison. They had fled from Germany and Poland and France, had hidden in attics and basements and forests, had watched their families and communities destroyed. They came to America with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a desperate hope for a new beginning. Dorothy taught them to sew, patiently showing them how to thread a needle and make a straight seam, how to read a pattern and measure fabric. She taught them the skills she had learned from her grandmother, the skills that saved her during the Depression and given her purpose during the war. And in teaching them, she found a new kind of purpose, one that felt less dramatic than her wartime work, but no less important. She was helping these women rebuild their lives, giving them tools they could use to support themselves and their families. It wasn't destroying tanks or winning battles, but it was making a difference in ways she could see and measure. One of her students, a Polish woman named Zofia who had survived Auschwitz, eventually opened a small tailor shop with Dorothy's help. Another, a French woman named Marie, found work at a costume shop for a Detroit theater company. These small victories, these individual stories of recovery and rebuilding, became the measure of Dorothy's post-war life. The years passed, and slowly Dorothy built a new life from the pieces of the old one. She continued teaching, expanding her work to include not just refugees, but anyone who wanted to learn. She took an extra work when she needed money, building a reputation as someone who could handle difficult projects with skill and reliability. She saved enough to move to a slightly better apartment, one with 2 bedrooms and windows that actually sealed against the winter cold. She bought herself a new coat, the first new clothing she had purchased in years, and felt absurdly proud of this small luxury. She made friends among the refugee community, people who understood something about sacrifice and survival, who didn't need explanations for the shadows that sometimes crossed her face when she was caught off guard by a memory. She learned to live with the classified nature of her wartime work, learned to deflect questions about what she had done during the war with vague references to factory work and war production. The commendation remained in her dresser drawer, a piece of paper she took out occasionally and read when she needed to remind herself that her life had mattered, that she had done something important even if the world would never know the details. The years became decades, and the war receded into history, studied by school children who could never quite grasp the reality of what it had been like to live through those years. In 1967, 22 years after the war's end, Dorothy received an unexpected letter. It came in an official envelope, marked with government seals, and for a moment she felt the old anxiety return, the fear that somehow she had made a mistake, that something she had sown had failed with terrible consequences. But when she opened the letter, she found something entirely different. The government was declassifying certain aspects of wartime production programs, the letter explained, and her work in Base 7 was among the projects being acknowledged publicly for the first time. The letter included a more detailed accounting of her contributions than she had ever been given during the war. The pouches she had made had been used in operations across Europe, from France to Yugoslavia to Italy. The 31 tanks represented only the confirmed kills and reports that had been fully processed. The actual number was probably higher. Her pouches had earned reputation among OSS operatives and partisan groups as the most reliable equipment in the field, and several commanders had specifically requested Detroit-made pouches for critical operations. The letter concluded by informing her that she was being awarded the Army Commendation Medal for Civilian Service, one of the highest honors available to non-military personnel, and that there would be a ceremony in Detroit the following month if she wished to attend. Dorothy went to the ceremony, held in a downtown hotel ballroom decorated with patriotic bunting and filled with veterans and their families. She fell out of place among the uniforms and medals, a small elderly woman in a borrowed dress. But when her name was called and she walked to the podium to receive her medal, the room erupted in applause. A general she didn't know pinned the medal to her dress and shook her hand, and a photographer took pictures that would appear in the Detroit Free Press the next day. After the ceremony, people came up to thank her, veterans who said they had friends who had been saved by the kind of equipment she made, children of men who had fought in Europe and might have benefited from the work she did. Dorothy accepted their thanks with grace and humility, still not quite able to believe that her work, done in secret in a warehouse bay 25 years ago, was being recognized like this. Ruth was there, older now but still fierce and proud, and she hugged Dorothy tightly and said, "Now the world knows what I always knew. You're a hero." Dorothy protested, embarrassed, but Ruth just laughed. "A hero isn't someone who isn't afraid," she said. "It's someone who does what needs to be done despite the fear. You did that. You were brave in your own way, and you saved lives. That makes you a hero,